She thought it was a game, dropping $5,000 in front of a struggling single dad waiting for him to fail. But when he walked straight past the cash and gave it to a church, she was frozen stunned by what real integrity looked like. Elizabeth Reynolds remained in her black Mercedes-tinted windows, hiding her disbelief as she watched James Cooper disappear through the church doors. Her manicured fingers tightened around the steering wheel. This wasn't how her experiment was supposed to end. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as James Cooper locked the door to his modest apartment. He turned to see Sophie bouncing on her toes, her pink backpack swaying with each movement. Despite the exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders from another late shift as a security guard, he managed a warm smile for his daughter. "Ready for our special breakfast, sweetheart?" James asked, taking her small hand in his. "Yes. Can I get chocolate chip pancakes?" Sophie's eyes sparkled with excitement. James's heart tightened as he mentally calculated the cost. The envelope from the insurance company sat unopened on his kitchen counter, another denial of coverage for Sophie's asthma medication. He'd have to call them again tomorrow, another hour navigating the labyrinth of automated systems and unsympathetic representatives. "We'll see what they have today." "Okay." They walked the 3 blocks to Maggie's Diner, a local establishment that had seen better days. The neon sign flickered intermittently, and the red vinyl booth showed patches where the stuffing peeked through, but it was clean and the prices were reasonable. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, the familiar scent of coffee and bacon wrapped around them like a warm blanket. A few early morning regulars hunched over their newspapers and mugs of steaming coffee. Frank, a Vietnam veteran with a permanent scowl that masked a gentle heart, raised his mug in silent greeting. The Sunday morning ritual had become sacred for James and Sophie after Catherine's accident 3 years ago, a small attempt at normalcy in a world that had shifted beneath their feet. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customers," Maggie called from behind the counter. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her smile was genuine as she watched Sophie skip toward their usual booth. James slid into the worn vinyl seat across from his daughter, wincing as his back protested. The overnight shift had been particularly grueling, moving heavy equipment for a building inspection and standing guard until dawn. At 42, his body reminded him daily that he wasn't getting any younger. "You look tired, honey," Maggie said, approaching their table with 2 menus and a pot of coffee. "Long night," James replied with a slight shrug, accepting a cup of the steaming brew. "Thank you, Maggie." Sophie opened her menu with the serious concentration of a scholar studying ancient texts, even though James knew she couldn't read most of the words. "Daddy, can you read the pancake part to me?" His eyes automatically went to the prices first. The chocolate chip pancakes were $8.99. His heart sank, but he kept his voice steady. "How about we split the short stack special? It comes with eggs and bacon." Sophie's face fell slightly, but she nodded bravely. "Okay, Daddy, can we share the bacon too?" "Of course, Princess." He reached across the table to tap her nose, making her giggle. As Maggie took their order, James noticed a well-dressed woman sitting alone in a corner booth. She seemed out of place in the humble diner, with her tailored business suit and perfectly styled silver hair. She was studying something on her tablet with intense focus, while occasionally sipping from a china teacup Maggie reserved for special customers. "Daddy, look." Sophie's excited whisper drew his attention back. She was drawing angels in the condensation on the window with her finger. "I made Mommy watching over us." James's throat tightened. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." Their breakfast arrived and James carefully divided everything into 2 portions, making sure Sophie got the slightly larger share. He watched as she savored each bite of pancake, making them last as long as possible. "Is it good?" "The best?" She offered him a forkful of her portion. "Try it, Daddy." He accepted the bite, making an exaggerated sound that made her laugh. The truth was he barely tasted it. His mind was already on the stack of bills waiting at home and Sophie's dwindling asthma medication. The prescription bottle that should have lasted another 2 weeks was already running low, and the refill would cost $350 without insurance coverage. Sophie's small inhaler sat in the side pocket of her backpack, always within reach. The pediatrician had emphasized the importance of consistent medication for managing her condition, but the pharmaceutical company had tripled the price in the last year. James had written letters, made calls, applied for assistance programs, all dead ends. Sophie suddenly began coughing, a harsh, dry sound that sent immediate alarm through James's body. He recognized the early signs of an asthma attack, the slight wheeze that followed each cough. Without hesitation, he reached for her backpack, retrieving the inhaler with practiced efficiency. Easy, Soph. Remember what we practiced. In through your nose, slowly now. Sophie's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded, taking the inhaler and following the routine they'd practiced countless times. James's military medical training kicked in calm, methodical, focused. As a former Army medic who later became a nurse, these moments brought back the muscle memory of battlefield triage, though nothing compared to the terror of watching his own child struggle to breathe. From the corner booth, Elizabeth Reynolds watched with unexpected interest. What had begun as casual observation was now full attention as she witnessed the methodical care with which the man handled his daughter's medical episode. There was something practiced in his movements, professional, almost clinical, yet suffused with tenderness, that only a parent could provide. The girl's breathing gradually stabilized, color returning to her cheeks. The father continued monitoring, counting breaths under his breath, his fingers discreetly checking her pulse at the wrist. These weren't the actions of an ordinary parent. This was someone with medical training. Elizabeth's phone buzzed with an email notification, another message from the PR team about the upcoming board meeting. The pharmaceutical company she ran, Reynolds Healthcare, was facing increasing public scrutiny for their price increases on several essential medications, including the very asthma medication this child was using. The proposed community health initiative was meant to soften their image, but they needed the right face for the campaign, someone authentic, someone the public would trust. The morning sun caught the girl's brown curls as she leaned against her father's arm, recovered, but clearly tired from the episode. The father's face showed the particular exhaustion Elizabeth recognized in parents of chronically ill children, the vigilant fatigue that never fully abated. "Daddy, it's okay," the girl whispered, patting her father's hand. "I'm going to make you a treasure map today. It'll lead to a big treasure that will fix everything." Something tightened in Elizabeth's chest, an uncomfortable sensation she hadn't felt in years. She quickly returned her attention to her tablet, scrolling through the article that had occupied her morning, The Integrity Experiment: Finding Authentic Voices in a Cynical World. The behavioral psychology piece discussed how extreme situations reveal true character, how financial temptation could separate performance from genuine integrity. Elizabeth had grown cynical during her 25 years in the pharmaceutical industry. She'd watched idealistic doctors and researchers slowly compromise their values for funding, seen advocacy groups change positions after strategic donations. Everyone had a price, it was just a matter of finding it. As CEO of Reynolds Healthcare, Elizabeth had masterminded its rise from a mid-sized pharmaceutical company to an industry leader. At 55, she had everything money could buy and very few people who dared to tell her no. The board tolerated her occasional eccentricities because she delivered consistent profit growth, even if her methods sometimes raised eyebrows. But the latest PR crisis was threatening even her position. Reynolds Healthcare had raised prices on 15 critical medications in the past year, including a 300% increase on their most popular asthma medication for children. The public backlash was fierce, and the board was growing nervous about potential regulatory attention. Elizabeth needed to win something to humanize the company and distract from the price hikes. The community health clinic initiative seemed perfect, but it needed a face the public would trust, someone with authentic medical credentials who could speak passionately about community care. Finding such a person who would willingly associate with Reynolds Healthcare was proving difficult. As she observed the man and his daughter preparing to leave, a plan began forming in her mind. The article on her tablet suddenly seemed like more than theoretical psychology. It was an opportunity for a real-world test. If this man had the integrity he appeared to possess, he might be exactly who the company needed. A small voice in the back of Elizabeth's mind whispered that this was manipulation, using a family's financial vulnerability for corporate gain. She silenced it with practiced ease. If her plan worked, it would be mutually beneficial. The man would receive financial support, and Reynolds would get their spokesperson. A fair exchange, nothing more. Elizabeth paid her bill and walked toward the exit, timing her movements to pass near their table. With deliberate casualness, she dropped an unmarked envelope on the floor, making sure it landed where the man would notice it. Without looking back, she continued to the door, the bell chiming as she stepped out into the morning sunshine. Through the window, she watched him notice the envelope, call out to her, then examine the contents. His expression shifted from shock to disbelief as he discovered the $5,000 in cash inside. Elizabeth's pulse quickened with interest. This was the moment of truth. What would an honest man do when no one was watching? James stared at the envelope's contents with disbelief. $5,000 in $100 bills. No name, no note, just cash. Enough to cover Sophie's medication for months, enough to catch her up on rent, enough to fix the rattling sound in his 15-year-old car. "What is it, Daddy?" Sophie asked, craning her neck to see. "Someone dropped something important," he replied, his mind racing. Through the window, he spotted the well-dressed woman walking briskly toward a luxury car parked across the street. He should run after her return what wasn't his. But for a moment, a single terrible moment, James considered what that money could do for them. The weight of his unpaid bills, Sophie's medical expenses, and the constant struggle to make ends meet pressed down on him. That money could solve so many problems, at least temporarily. No one would know if he kept it. It would be so easy to simply slip it into his pocket. But then he looked at Sophie drawing her angels on the window, and he knew he couldn't. What kind of example would that set? What would Catherine have said? "Finish your pancakes, sweetheart," he said, gently gripping the envelope tightly. "I need to take care of something important." He moved to the door, but the woman had already driven away in a sleek black Mercedes. James stood on the sidewalk, the envelope heavy in his hand. The woman was gone, but the money remained, along with the moral question it posed. "What you got there, Jimmy?" Frank called from his seat by the window, eyeing the envelope with curiosity. James hesitated only briefly. "Someone dropped this. I'm going to take it to Pastor Wilson at First Baptist. If anyone comes looking for it, send them there." Frank nodded with approval, returning to his newspaper. Always doing the right thing even when it costs you. Catherine would be proud. The mention of his late wife strengthened James's resolve. He took Sophie's hand and began walking toward the small white church 3 blocks away. The First Baptist Church of Oak Ridge was a modest building with a loyal congregation. Pastor Wilson had been a source of support after Catherine's death, offering counseling and occasionally helping with bills when things got particularly tight. As they walked, James felt the weight of the envelope in his pocket, $5,000. The temptation wasn't gone, just firmly placed behind his sense of right and wrong. Sophie skipped beside him, humming a tune from her favorite cartoon, blissfully unaware of the moral test her father was facing. Elizabeth Reynolds followed at a distance in her Mercedes, curiosity overriding her initial plan to simply drive away. She'd expected him to pocket the money most people would have. When he'd headed toward the church instead, she found herself trailing him, suddenly invested in seeing this experiment through to its conclusion. The white church stood against the clear blue sky, its simple steeple reaching toward heaven without pretension. Elizabeth parked across the street, watching as the man and his daughter climbed the steps and disappeared inside. She should leave. She had already crossed ethical lines with this impromptu test, but something kept her there, engine idling, waiting. Inside the church, the cool air smelled of wood polish and aging hymnals. Pastor Wilson was arranging flowers at the altar when they entered. "James, Sophie, good to see you both." The older man smiled warmly, setting down a vase of daisies. "You're early for service today." James approached Sophie, still holding his hand. "Pastor, someone dropped this outside Maggie's diner. I couldn't catch them to return it, but I thought maybe they might come looking for it here." He handed over the envelope, watching as Pastor Wilson's eyebrows rose upon seeing its contents. $5,000 with no identification. The pastor looked up, studying James's face. "That's quite a fine son." James nodded, feeling Sophie's small hand in his. "Thought about keeping it," he admitted quietly. "We could use it. Sophie's medication isn't covered by insurance anymore, and the rent's going up next month." Pastor Wilson's eyes softened with understanding. "But you brought it here instead." "Sophie needs her medicine, but she needs a father who knows right from wrong even more." James glanced down at his daughter, who was examining a colorful bulletin board with children's artwork. "I can't teach her integrity, then compromise my own when it's convenient." Unknown to them, Elizabeth had quietly entered the church, positioning herself in a back pew where she could overhear their conversation. The man's words struck her with unexpected force. In her world of corporate negotiations and strategic compromises, such straightforward moral reasoning was rare. "We'll hold it for 2 weeks," Pastor Wilson was saying. "If no one claim it, we can consider it a donation to the church." Perhaps some of it could help with Sophie's medication. James shook his head firmly. It's not mine to direct pastor. If no one claims it, it should go to the church food bank or the emergency assistance fund. There are families worse off than us. Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, a long-dormant part of herself responding to this man's unwavering moral compass. In 20 years as CEO, she'd grown accustomed to people who adjusted their ethics to accommodate financial incentives. This simple, clear adherence to principle, regardless of personal cost, was, disorienting. Before she could process this reaction, a harsh coughing sound broke the quiet church atmosphere. Sophie was doubled over, her small body racked with increasingly desperate attempts to breathe. The coughing rapidly transformed into a high-pitched wheeze that echoed ominously in the vaulted space. James rushed to his daughter, face taut with controlled fear. "Sophie, where's your inhaler, sweetheart?" Sophie's eyes widened with panic as she pointed to her backpack, which she'd set down by the bulletin board. James grabbed it, searching frantically for the inhaler, only to find it empty when he finally located it. "No, no, no, no," he muttered, checking his own pockets for a backup. "Pastor, call 911. She's having a severe attack and her rescue inhaler is empty." Pastor Wilson moved quickly to the church office, while James assessed Sophie with clinical precision despite his rising panic. Her lips were developing a bluish tint, her chest retracting with each labored breath, signs of serious respiratory distress. Elizabeth rose from her hiding place, medical training from decades earlier, surging to the forefront of her mind. Before becoming a pharmaceutical executive, she'd been a respiratory specialist, a life she'd left behind after personal tragedy. "I can help," she announced, approaching quickly. "I'm a doctor." James barely registered the woman from the diner as he supported Sophie, who was now sitting on a pew struggling for each breath. "She has severe asthma. Her inhaler's empty, and we don't have a backup." Elizabeth knelt beside the girl, her corporate armor falling away as medical instincts took over. "Sophie, I'm Elizabeth. I'm going to help you breathe okay. Your dad's right here." From her purse, Elizabeth retrieved a small emergency medical kit, a habit she'd maintained from her physician days. Inside was an epinephrine auto-injector, not ideal for asthma, but potentially life-saving in an emergency like this. "I have an EpiPen," she explained to James. "It's not specifically for asthma, but it can help open her airways until the ambulance arrives. It's your call." James assessed the situation with the rapid calculation of a combat medic. Sophie's condition was deteriorating quickly. The ambulance might not arrive in time. Looking into Elizabeth's eyes, he saw competence and certainty. "Do it." He nodded sharply. Elizabeth administered the injection with practiced efficiency, then guided James in positioning Sophie to maximize airflow. Together, they monitored her breathing, counting each labored inhalation while Pastor Wilson informed them the ambulance was on its way. "Sophie, listen to my voice," James murmured, keeping his tone steady despite his internal panic. "Remember our special breathing, in through the nose, like you're smelling flowers. Out through the mouth, like you're blowing out birthday candles." "That's my brave girl." Gradually, Sophie's breathing eased slightly, not normalized, but the desperate struggle subsided enough that her lips regained some color. The epinephrine was working, buying precious minutes until professional help arrived. Throughout this crisis, Elizabeth watched James with growing fascination. His response wasn't just that of a terrified father. It reflected professional medical training. His positioning of Sophie, the way he monitored her vital signs, his calm instructions, these were the actions of someone with significant medical experience. When paramedics arrived minutes later, James briefed them with precise medical terminology, describing Sophie's condition, medication history, and the emergency intervention with the clarity of a healthcare professional. "Former Army medic, then ER nurse," he explained briefly when one paramedic raised an eyebrow at his detailed report. "Switched careers after my wife died. Couldn't handle hospital schedules as a single dad." The paramedics prepared Sophie for transport, attaching an oxygen mask that immediately eased her breathing. James turned to Elizabeth, really seeing her for the first time. "Thank you. You saved my daughter's life," he said simply, the depth of his gratitude evident in his voice. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Elizabeth felt unexpectedly moved by his sincerity. In her corporate world, gratitude was usually a transactional part of a carefully maintained network of favors and obligations. This raw, unguarded appreciation was something else entirely. "I'm coming with you to the hospital." she found herself saying. My car's outside. I can drive you behind the ambulance. James hesitated, natural caution warring with pragmatism. Public transport would take too long, and a taxi would be an expense he couldn't afford. With a quick nod, he accepted, following the stretcher carrying Sophie out to the ambulance. Pastor Wilson approached Elizabeth as James conferred with the paramedics outside. You're the one who dropped that envelope, aren't you? He asked quietly. Elizabeth stiffened, unused to being read so easily. What makes you say that? Just an old pastor's intuition, he replied with a gentle smile. And the timing of your arrival seemed providential. Elizabeth didn't confirm or deny, but her expression softened slightly. James and his daughter, they've had a difficult time. Pastor Wilson nodded solemnly. Catherine James's wife died 3 years ago. Car accident on the interstate. James was an exceptional nurse, but he gave up his hospital career to work jobs with flexible hours for Sophie. The night security work and day shifts at the auto plant are killing him slowly, but he never complains. Something resonated painfully in Elizabeth's chest. The loss of a spouse, the sacrifice for a child, it echoed her own buried history in ways she'd spent decades avoiding. I should go, she said abruptly. They'll need a ride to the hospital. As she turned to leave, Pastor Wilson added, that money you left James could have kept it. No one would have known, but that's not who he is. Elizabeth paused at the door. No, I don't believe it is. The drive to Oak Ridge Community Hospital followed the ambulance's flashing lights through morning traffic. In her sleek Mercedes, Elizabeth stole glances at James, noting the controlled tension in his jaw, the way his fingers unconsciously formed and reformed fists on his knees. She'll be okay, Elizabeth offered. The epinephrine helped significantly, and they got her on oxygen quickly. James nodded without looking away from the ambulance ahead. This is the third severe attack in 2 months. It's getting worse and without consistent medication. He trailed off the implications, hanging heavily between them. At the hospital, Sophie was rushed into the emergency department while James was stopped at the registration desk. Elizabeth watched his face darken as he was handed insurance forms and a clipboard. We need to verify your insurance status before proceeding with non-emergency treatment, the intake clerk explained with practiced neutrality. She's having an asthma attack, James replied, his voice tight with restraint. Her oxygen levels were at 87% in the ambulance. The emergency physician is with her now, sir. This is for any additional treatment or medication she might need afterward. James began filling out the forms, his handwriting precise despite his obvious distress. Elizabeth observed the process with growing discomfort, seeing the healthcare system from the patient side, a perspective she usually only encountered in carefully managed focus groups and surveys. When the clerk asked for a co-payment and mentioned previous outstanding balances, Elizabeth stepped forward impulsively. Charge it to me, she stated, producing a platinum credit card. Any costs not covered by insurance bill, them all to this card. James looked up sharply. That's not necessary. I can handle. Please, Elizabeth interrupted with uncharacteristic gentleness. Let me do this. You can object later, after Sophie's taken care of. Something in her tone must have conveyed the futility of arguing. James gave a tight nod and returned to the forms while Elizabeth handled the financial arrangements with efficient authority. When they were finally allowed into the treatment area, Sophie was looking better. The oxygen mask had been replaced with a nasal cannula, and her color was improving. A nebulizer treatment was underway, the fine mist delivering medication directly to her lungs. Daddy, Sophie's face lit up despite her exhaustion. Did you see the ambulance? They let me turn on the siren. James's composure finally cracked just slightly as he took her small hand in his. That must have been exciting, sweetheart. How are you feeling now? Better. The nice doctor said I was super brave. Her gaze shifted to Elizabeth, who stood awkwardly at the entrance to the treatment bay. You helped me at the church. You're the lady from the restaurant. Elizabeth moved closer, uncomfortable with the child's direct recognition. Children weren't part of her usual interactions. The pharmaceutical industry dealt with them as abstract demographics, not as individual faces with curious eyes. Yes, I'm Elizabeth, she confirmed, unsure what else to say. Are you Daddy's friend? Sophie asked with the directness only children manage. Before Elizabeth could formulate a response, the attending physician entered, a harried-looking woman in her 40s with a tablet computer and a practiced smile. Mr. Cooper, I'm Dr. Patel. Sophie's responding well to treatment, but I'm concerned about the frequency of these severe attacks. The paramedics mentioned this is the third episode in 2 months. James nodded, shifting seamlessly into his former medical professional role. Yes, her maintenance medication changed when the insurance stopped covering the previous one. The new formulation doesn't seem to be as effective. Dr. Patel frowned, tapping notes into her tablet. I see that. I'd like to prescribe a different controller medication, one of the newer combinations that's showing better results for cases like Sophie's. What's the cost without insurance coverage? James asked immediately. The doctor hesitated. It's about $450 per month. I know that's significant, but given the severity of her attacks, we'll make it work, James interrupted, though Elizabeth could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the mental reshuffling of already stretched finances. Dr. Patel continued her examination, checking Sophie's lung sounds and oxygen levels while discussing a revised treatment plan. Throughout the conversation, James asked informed questions, clearly drawing on his nursing background to advocate for his daughter. Elizabeth observed this interaction with growing interest. Here was the medical professional beneath the security guard uniform, the expertise that had been sidelined by circumstance. And beyond that, she recognized something increasingly rare in her experience, someone whose core values remained unwavering despite personal cost. When Dr. Patel left promising discharge papers within the hour, James turned to Elizabeth with a direct gaze. I appreciate your help today, and especially the quick thinking at the church. But I can't accept you're paying Sophie's hospital bills. That's my responsibility. Elizabeth considered her response carefully. In business negotiations, she was accustomed to calculating the most advantageous approach, anticipating objections, and maneuvering toward her desired outcome. But something about James's straightforward integrity demanded a different strategy: honesty. I'm Elizabeth Reynolds, she stated plainly, CEO of Reynolds Healthcare. The change in James's expression was immediate, a stiffening of his shoulders, a slight narrowing of his eyes as recognition dawned. Reynolds Healthcare, he repeated flatly, the company that tripled the price of Sophie's asthma medication last year. Elizabeth didn't flinch from his gaze. Yes, the same one. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The CEO of the company, whose pricing policies had directly impacted Sophie's health, was now offering to pay for the consequences of those same policies. Why are you here? James asked, keeping his voice low enough that Sophie, who was drawing on a paper cup with crayons provided by a nurse, couldn't hear. Was this some kind of set up the envelope at the diner? Elizabeth glanced at Sophie, then back to James. Not exactly, at least not initially. I was at the diner researching the area for a potential community project. The envelope was an impulse, a test, I suppose. A test, James repeated the words flat. And what exactly were you testing? Integrity, Elizabeth answered simply. I needed to find someone with genuine integrity for a project I'm developing, someone the public would trust. James's laugh held no humor. And you thought dropping $5,000 in front of a struggling single father would be a good integrity test? That's not research, Ms. Reynolds. That's manipulation. The accusation stung more than Elizabeth expected. In the corporate world, strategic maneuvering was standard practice, identifying leverage points and applying pressure to achieve desired outcomes. But framed in James's blunt assessment, her actions took on a different character. You're right, she conceded, surprising herself with the admission. It was manipulative, but your response was unexpected, because I didn't keep the money. James shook his head slightly. That says more about your expectations than my character. Before Elizabeth could respond, a nurse arrived with discharge papers and prescriptions. James reviewed them with professional thoroughness, signing where indicated and asking clarifying questions about follow-up care. When they were finally alone again, Sophie had fallen asleep, exhausted from her ordeal. James arranged her hospital blanket more comfortably and turned back to Elizabeth. Thank you for your help today, he said quietly. Whatever your motivations, you helped save Sophie's life, and I'm grateful. But whatever test or project you're running, I'm not interested. Elizabeth had faced countless rejections in her career, from regulators, competitors, even her own board, but none had left her feeling quite so thoroughly assessed and found wanting. I understand, she replied, but before you dismiss the opportunity entirely, I'd like you to hear what the project actually is. James glanced at his sleeping daughter, then checked his watch. I need to get Sophie home and I have a shift at the plant in 4 hours. I can drive you both, Elizabeth offered, and I can explain on the way. After a moment's consideration, James nodded reluctantly. The practical reality of getting a tired child home outweighing his desire to distance himself from Elizabeth Reynolds and everything she represented. The drive back to James' apartment was quiet at first, Sophie sleeping in the back seat of the luxury sedan secured with care, despite James's obvious discomfort with their surroundings. The contrast between the hand-me-down clothes Sophie wore and the butter-soft leather seats of the $120,000 vehicle wasn't lost on either adult. Reynolds Healthcare is launching a community health initiative. Elizabeth finally began keeping her voice low. A network of affordable clinics in underserved areas, starting with communities like Oak Ridge. James's expression remained skeptical. A PR move to distract from the price increases. Partially, Elizabeth admitted, appreciating that pretending otherwise would only damage her credibility further. The board needs a positive story to counterbalance the pricing coverage, but the clinics themselves would provide real services, affordable care regardless of insurance status. And where do I fit into this corporate image rehabilitation? Elizabeth turned onto James's street, following his quiet directions. The initiative needs a medical advisor, someone with both professional knowledge and community credibility. Your background as both a military medic and an ER nurse combined with your perspective as a parent navigating the system makes you uniquely qualified. She pulled up in front of his apartment building, a utilitarian 3-story structure with peeling paint and a chain-link fence around a small, barren playground. The contrast with her own glass and steel penthouse in Minneapolis couldn't have been starker. I'd be the sympathetic face making Reynolds Healthcare look compassionate while you continue charging families like mine hundreds of dollars for medication that costs pennies to produce, James summarized bluntly. Elizabeth turned off the engine, giving him her full attention. I'm offering you a consulting position with significant compensation, enough to cover Sophie's medical expenses and more. You'd have direct input into how these clinics operate. James carefully gathered his still sleeping daughter into his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. Reynolds, I spent 10 years as a nurse watching patients choose between medication and food. I've held the hands of elderly people who cut their pills in half to make prescriptions last longer. I've seen children like Sophie suffer because pharmaceutical companies value profit over people's lives. He stood beside the car, Sophie's weight balanced with practiced ease. So thank you, but no, I won't help Reynolds Healthcare pretend to care about communities while continuing to exploit them. Elizabeth watched him walk away, Sophie's small hand dangling limply over his shoulder, her pink backpack clutched in his other hand. For the second time that day, James Cooper had defied her expectations completely. Instead of starting the car, Elizabeth remained parked, her mind working through this unexpected development. In her 25 years in business, she'd become accustomed to everyone having a price. The man who'd just walked away from a 6-figure consulting offer, while clearly struggling financially, challenged her fundamental understanding of human nature. But beyond that, his uncompromising stance had activated something long dormant within her. The physician she'd been before tragedy and ambition transformed her into the corporate executive she now was. Elizabeth reached for her phone, scrolling to a contact she rarely used anymore. After a moment's hesitation, she pressed call. Mark, it's Elizabeth Reynolds. I need everything you can find on James Cooper of Oak Ridge, Minnesota. Former Army medic, ER nurse. Has a daughter named Sophie, lost his wife Catherine about 3 years ago. Medical history, employment records, financial situation, everything. And I need it today. As she ended the call, Elizabeth knew she was crossing lines, professional, ethical, perhaps even legal. But something about James Cooper and his unwavering integrity had awakened a determination she hadn't felt in years. If he wouldn't voluntarily become part of her project, she would need to find another approach, one that addressed his principled objections rather than simply overriding them. The sun was setting as Elizabeth finally drove away from the modest apartment building, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Her mind was already formulating a new strategy, one that would require her to confront aspects of herself and her company that she'd spent years carefully avoiding. For the first time in decades, Elizabeth Reynolds found herself facing a challenge that money alone couldn't solve, and the realization was both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. Back in his apartment, James gently tucked Sophie into bed, placing her rescue inhaler within easy reach on the nightstand. The day's events had left him emotionally drained, from the moral dilemma of the envelope to the terror of Sophie's attack, culminating in the surreal encounter with the CEO of Reynolds Healthcare. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very company whose pricing policies directly threatened his daughter's health had literally appeared on his doorstep, offering financial salvation with strings carefully attached. It would have been laughable if it weren't so emblematic of the broken system he had been fighting for years. As he closed Sophie's bedroom door, his phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor at the auto plant. "Need you to come in early tomorrow. Big order, all hands required. 5 a.m. start." James sighed, calculating the hours of sleep he could manage between now and then. The security job would have to wait. He'd call in and take the attendance strike. Sophie needed him home tonight after her hospital visit. He sank onto the worn couch, allowing himself a rare moment of despair. The walls of his tiny apartment seemed to close in the stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter, a constant reminder of his precarious financial situation. Despite working 70 hours a week across 2 jobs, he was barely keeping their heads above water. Elizabeth Reynolds' offer lingered in his mind. The consulting position would solve their financial problems overnight. Sophie could have her medication, they could move to a better apartment, maybe even set aside something for her future education. All he had to do was become the public face for a company whose policies he considered fundamentally exploitative. The temptation was stronger than he wanted to admit. What good was moral high ground if Sophie suffered for it? Wasn't a father's first duty to protect his child? Catherine would have understood the compromise, might even have encouraged it for Sophie's sake. James rubbed his eyes, exhaustion seeping into his bones. Before he could sink deeper into these thoughts, a soft knock came at the bedroom door. "Daddy, are you still awake?" Sophie stood in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, clutching the stuffed elephant that had been Catherine's last gift to her. "Hey, sweetheart, you should be resting," James said gently. "I had a dream about Mommy," Sophie replied, climbing onto the couch beside him. "She was wearing her nurse clothes, and she was telling me to draw more angels." James smiled sadly, wrapping an arm around his daughter. Catherine had always encouraged Sophie's artistic talents, filling their home with her drawings and paintings. After the accident, Sophie had channeled her grief into creating angels, hundreds of them, watching over them from construction paper perches throughout the apartment. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he murmured. "Maybe tomorrow we can get you some new colored pencils." Sophie leaned against him, quiet for a moment. Then, with the direct insight that sometimes made James wonder if children weren't wiser than adults in some ways, she asked, "Was that lady today an angel or a witch?" The question startled a laugh from James. "What makes you ask that?" "She looked fancy like a witch in my storybooks," Sophie explained seriously. "But she helped me breathe like angels do." James considered how to answer, aware that his response would shape Sophie's understanding of nuance. "I think sometimes people can be a bit of both, Soph. She helped us today, which was kind, but her company makes decisions that make it hard for families like ours to get medicine." Sophie frowned, processing this complexity. "So she's a witch who sometimes does angel things." "Something like that," James agreed, struck by the apt description of Elizabeth Reynolds, a woman whose corporate policies caused suffering, yet who had personally helped save his daughter's life today. "People are complicated. I like it better when good people are just good and bad people are just bad," Sophie declared with a child's certainty. "It's confusing when they're mixed up." "It sure is, sweetheart," James agreed, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. "It sure is." As Sophie drifted back to sleep against his shoulder, James found himself thinking about Elizabeth Reynolds not as the CEO of a pharmaceutical giant, but as the woman who had knelt beside his daughter in church, administering emergency medication with professional calm. The woman whose carefully maintained corporate facade had briefly slipped, revealing something more complex beneath. Whatever game she was playing with her community clinic initiative and her interest in recruiting him, James sensed there was more to the story than simple corporate image rehabilitation. The intensity in her eyes when she'd spoken about the project suggested personal stakes beyond quarterly profits and board approval. But personal motivation or not, James couldn't reconcile himself to becoming a public relations tool for a company whose policies directly harm families like his. Some lines couldn't be crossed, no matter how attractive the compensation. The following morning arrived too quickly, the 4:30 a.m. alarm dragging James from insufficient sleep. He moved quietly through the darkened apartment, checking on Sophie before leaving a note for Mrs. Grayson next door, who would get Sophie ready for school once she woke. The auto plant was already humming with activity when he arrived the early shift preparing for a major order. James clocked in and headed to his station, where engine components waited for assembly. The work was physically demanding, but straightforward, a stark contrast to the complex medical procedures he'd once performed as an ER nurse. 3 hours into his shift, the floor supervisor approached. "Cooper, there's someone asking for you at reception. Says it's important." James frowned, immediately concerned about Sophie. "Did they say what it's about?" "Just that it can't wait. I'll cover your station for 15. Wiping grease from his hands, James made his way through the maze of machinery to the reception area. To his astonishment, Elizabeth Reynolds stood there in another impeccable business suit, looking entirely out of place among the industrial surroundings. "Mr. Cooper," she nodded formally, "I apologize for interrupting your work, but I believe this conversation couldn't wait." James crossed his arms defensively. "I thought I made my position clear yesterday." "You did," Elizabeth acknowledged, "which is why I'm here with a different proposal, one that addresses your objections." Before James could respond, the plant manager emerged from his office, clearly flustered by the presence of such a high-profile visitor. "Ms. Reynolds, this is an unexpected honor. If you'd prefer to use my office for your discussion—" "That won't be necessary," Elizabeth replied smoothly. "I only need a few minutes of Mr. Cooper's time." The plant manager retreated, but not before giving James a look that clearly communicated the importance of keeping this visitor happy. Reynolds Healthcare was a major client for several auto components manufactured at the plant, a connection James hadn't previously made. "You have 5 minutes," James stated, acutely aware of his grease-stained coveralls contrasted with her pristine appearance. "I need to get back to my station." Elizabeth handed him a sealed envelope. Unlike the one from the diner, this one bore the Reynolds Healthcare logo and was clearly official correspondence. "Inside, you'll find 2 things," she explained. "First, a formal proposal for the consulting position we discussed, with one significant modification. Part of your role would include serving on a newly formed patient advocacy committee with direct input on pricing policies for pediatric medications." James raised an eyebrow skeptically, but allowed her to continue. "Second, you'll find documentation of Reynolds Healthcare's new Compassionate Access Program, which provides qualifying families with essential medications at significantly reduced costs. Sophie has been pre-approved for the program regardless of your decision about the consulting position." James stared at the envelope, suspicion warring with cautious interest. "Why the sudden corporate benevolence?" Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "Because you were right yesterday about all of it. Reynolds Healthcare has prioritized profit over patients, and as CEO, that responsibility ultimately falls to me." The frank admission caught James off guard. He'd expected corporate doublespeak or manipulative leverage, not acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "This program, is it real or just for show?" he asked cautiously. "It's real," Elizabeth confirmed. "Limited in scope, currently focusing on pediatric respiratory medications first, but with plans to expand. The board approved it this morning, though not without resistance." James opened the envelope, scanning the documents with professional thoroughness. The Compassionate Access Program appeared legitimate, with clear qualification guidelines and substantial discounts. Sophie would indeed qualify, as would many children in similar circumstances. "Why me?" he finally asked. "There are plenty of medical professionals with better credentials who jump at this consulting opportunity." Elizabeth's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something personal breaking through her professional exterior. "Because yesterday you showed me what integrity looks like. Not just by refusing the money at the diner, but by refusing a lucrative position that conflicted with your principles, even when accepting would have solved your problems." She glanced at her watch, mindful of his limited break time. "I need someone who will tell me uncomfortable truths, Mr. Cooper. Someone who sees the human cost of corporate decisions and isn't afraid to advocate for change, even when it's difficult." James carefully refolded the documents, buying time to process this unexpected development. "And if I still say no, then the Compassionate Access Program still stands for Sophie. That's not contingent on your decision." Elizabeth handed him a business card with her private number handwritten on the back. "Take time to consider it. Talk to people you trust. Verify everything I've told you. I'll expect your answer within the week." With that, she nodded professionally and turned to leave her designer heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor of the manufacturing plant. James watched her go, the envelope heavy in his hands despite its lightweight contents. As he returned to his workstation, his mind raced with possibilities and suspicions. The program would ensure Sophie received her medication regardless of insurance coverage, a literal lifesaver. But accepting the consulting position meant aligning himself with Reynolds Healthcare, becoming part of the system he'd criticized for years. Could he affect more change from within than from outside? Or would he simply become another corporate tool, his principles gradually eroded by proximity to power and money? As he resumed assembling engine components with mechanical precision, James found himself wishing desperately that he could talk to Catherine. She'd always had an uncanny ability to see through complications to the heart of a matter. What would she advise him to do now? The answer came in a memory, Catherine sitting beside a patient's bed long after her shift had ended, advocating fiercely with hospital administration for treatment the insurance company had denied. Sometimes, she'd told him later, you have to enter the lion's den to change how the lions behave. For the first time since Elizabeth Reynolds had dropped her envelope at the diner, James felt a glimmer of clarity about the path forward. It wouldn't be simple or comfortable, but perhaps it offered something more valuable than either moral purity or financial security, the chance to create meaningful change. As the day shift ended, James clocked out and headed toward the bus stop, the Reynolds healthcare envelope secure in his backpack. Before making any decision, he needed to talk to Pastor Wilson and do his own research on Elizabeth Reynolds. The woman who had appeared in his life, so suddenly testing his integrity with cash and corporate offers, remained largely a mystery. Who was she beyond the corporate title and designer suits? And more importantly, could she be trusted to follow through on promises of corporate reform? Or was this elaborate recruitment effort simply another cynical public relations strategy? These questions followed James onto the bus, accompanying him on the long ride home to Sophie in the small apartment where angels watched from every wall, hand-drawn guardians observing another unexpected turn in a life that had already seen more than its share of challenges and changes. The Reynolds Healthcare boardroom fell silent as Elizabeth finished her presentation, 30 pairs of eyes fixed on the projection screen, displaying the Compassionate Access Program details. The morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated the disbelief on the board members' faces. Stephen Blake, the chief operating officer, leaned forward, his Italian suit stretching across broad shoulders as he examined the financial projections with open hostility. Let me make sure I understand correctly, he tapped his Mont Blanc pen rhythmically against the polished mahogany table. You want to voluntarily reduce our profit margins on our most successful pediatric medications by 30%. After we just weathered a PR crisis for increasing those same prices. Elizabeth remained standing, her posture unwavering. The crisis isn't weathered, Stephen. It's ongoing, and it's damaging both our share price and our relationship with healthcare providers. This program addresses both issues while helping children who need these medications. Noble sentiments, Stephen's voice dripped with condescension. But we're running a pharmaceutical company, not a charity. Our responsibility is to our shareholders. Around the table, several board members nodded in agreement. Elizabeth had anticipated this resistance, but seeing it manifest still sparked a familiar anger. These people lived in the same protected bubble she had occupied for years, isolated from the consequences of their pricing decisions by layers of corporate structure and personal wealth. Our responsibility, she countered, advancing to the next slide showing a young girl in a hospital bed, oxygen mask obscuring half her face, is to create life-saving medications and ensure they reach the patients who need them. Medications that sit on pharmacy shelves because families can't afford them fell our core mission. The image of the hospitalized child caused several board members to shift uncomfortably. Elizabeth had deliberately chosen a photo reminiscent of Sophie, though not actually her. The psychological impact was exactly as intended. This isn't just ethical positioning. She continued, moving to financial projections. The program will generate significant tax advantages, positive press coverage worth millions in equivalent advertising, and improved relationships with prescribers. Most importantly, it positions us ahead of likely regulatory changes. Senator Mercer's proposed bill on pharmaceutical pricing transparency gained support daily. The mention of potential regulation caused a ripple of concern through the room. If there was one thing pharmaceutical executives feared more than reduced profits, It was government intervention in their pricing models. Stephen leaned back, arms crossed defensively. And this patient advocacy committee you're proposing, staffed with outsiders who have no understanding of our business realities? You're essentially inviting critics into our decision-making process. I'm inviting perspective, Elizabeth corrected him firmly. Medical professionals who see firsthand how our pricing affects patients. Their insight will be advisory, with final decisions remaining with executive leadership. The discussion continued for another hour, arguments and counter-arguments flying across the boardroom. Elizabeth fielded each objection with practiced precision, her decades of corporate experience evident in every response. By the meeting's end, she had secured a narrow approval contingent on quarterly reviews and the right to terminate the program if financial impacts exceeded projections. As the board members filed out, Stephen lingered behind his expression, unreadable. You're playing a dangerous game, Elizabeth. First, the pricing transparency initiative. Last quarter, now this. The board is starting to wonder where your priorities lie. Elizabeth gathered her presentation materials calmly. My priority is ensuring Reynolds Healthcare remains profitable and relevant for the next 20 years, not just the next quarter. Times are changing, Stephen. Companies that don't adapt will be regulated into compliance or legislated into irrelevance. Stephen moved closer, lowering his voice. This isn't about business strategy. It's personal for you now, isn't it? Ever since David. The mention of her son's name sent a cold spike through Elizabeth's chest. Stephen was one of the few executives who had known her long enough to remember the tragedy that had altered the trajectory of her life, the car accident 15 years ago that had claimed both her husband Michael and their 10-year-old son David. This is about sound business judgment. Elizabeth maintained her professional tone despite the emotional ambush. Nothing more. If you say so. Stephen's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just remember, sentiment has no place in this business. The board indulges your occasional humanitarian projects because you deliver results. The moment that changes, so will their patience. With that parting threat hanging in the air, Stephen departed, leaving Elizabeth alone in the vast boardroom. She sank into her leather chair, allowing herself a moment of private vulnerability, now that no corporate eyes were watching. The program had been approved, her first concrete step toward redemption, both professional and personal. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Pastor Wilson vouches for you. We should talk. James Cooper. A small smile touched Elizabeth's lips as she tapped out a response, setting a meeting for later that afternoon at a cafe near the auto plant. The hardest part of her plan was just beginning convincing James Cooper not only to accept the consulting position, but to become a true ally in transforming Reynolds Healthcare from within. The irony wasn't lost on her seeking help from a man who had every reason to distrust both her and her company, but his unflinching integrity was precisely what the initiative needed. More importantly, it was what she needed to navigate the treacherous path ahead, where corporate politics and personal redemption would inevitably collide. 2 hours later, Elizabeth sat at a corner table in Riverside Cafe, a modest establishment frequented by workers from the nearby industrial park. She had deliberately dressed down for this meeting, a simple blouse and slacks rather than her usual designer suit, minimal jewelry, and less severe styling of her silver hair. The goal wasn't deception, but reducing the visual barriers between their worlds. James arrived precisely on time, still in his work coveralls, a smudge of machine oil visible on his forearm. The cafe patrons glanced curiously at their unlikely meeting, the auto plant worker and the elegant older woman engaged in intense conversation. I appreciate you meeting me, Elizabeth began, pushing a folder across the table. These are the official documents for the Compassionate Access Program. The board approved it this morning. Sophie's application has already been processed. James examined the papers with careful attention, his expression guarded. Pastor Wilson says you've been asking a lot of questions about me, my military service, my nursing career, Catherine. Yes, Elizabeth acknowledged, seeing no benefit in denial. I needed to understand who I was dealing with. Your background is impressive. Combat medic with 2 tours in Afghanistan. Head trauma nurse at Minneapolis General for 7 years. Commendations from both the military and the hospital. James set the folder down, meeting her gaze directly. And what about you, Ms. Reynolds? I've done my own research. Yale Medical School. Respiratory specialist. Left medicine after your husband and son died in a car accident. Took over your family's pharmaceutical company and transformed it from a mid-sized generic manufacturer to one of the largest specialty pharma companies in the country. A flicker of surprise crossed Elizabeth's face. She hadn't expected him to investigate her personal history. "You've been thorough," she acknowledged. "When someone drops 5,000 at my feet as a test, then offers me a job, I make it my business to know who they are." James leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "What I couldn't figure out is why the CEO of Reynolds Healthcare is personally recruiting a factory worker for a consulting position that any number of medical professionals would jump at." Elizabeth considered her response carefully. This moment would determine whether James became an ally or remained a skeptic. Corporate platitudes wouldn't work. Only the truth, however uncomfortable, would suffice. "Because you remind me of who I used to be," she finally admitted. "For I became more concerned with profit margins than patient outcomes. Before I started justifying price increases with shareholder value instead of human cost." The raw honesty of her response created a momentary silence between them. Outside the cafe window, workers changed shifts at the plant, a stream of tired men and women heading home after hours of physical labor. "The accident that killed my husband and son happened in a rural area with limited emergency services." Elizabeth continued, her voice steady despite the painful subject. "By the time help arrived, it was too late. I told myself I was joining Reynolds to prevent similar tragedies, to ensure vital medications were developed and distributed where they were needed. And somewhere along the way, that mission got lost." James observed, neither accusatory nor sympathetic, simply stating a fact. Elizabeth nodded, a tightness in her throat. "Success has its own momentum. Each quarter we needed to exceed the last. Each year brought new pressure from investors, new competitors, new market challenges. The distance between executive decisions and patient impact grew until it became an abstraction. Numbers on spreadsheets rather than people struggling to breathe." "Like Sophie," James said quietly. "Like Sophie," Elizabeth agreed. "Seeing her attack, watching you handle it with such care despite inadequate resources, it wasn't just a reminder of my former life as a doctor. It forced me to confront the direct line between our boardroom decisions and your daughter's suffering." James studied her for a long moment, weighing her sincerity against his justified skepticism. "Let's say I believe you've had this convenient moral awakening. Why not just implement changes through your existing executive authority? Why involve me at all?" "Because I need someone who will hold me accountable," Elizabeth answered without hesitation. "Someone who sees the human cost, who understands the medical realities, and who won't be seduced or intimidated by corporate culture." The moment I announced these initiatives, forces within the company began mobilizing against them. Without external pressure and expertise, they'll be diluted into meaninglessness within months. James tapped the folder thoughtfully. "So I'd be your corporate conscience, the voice reminding Reynolds Healthcare that its decisions affect real people." "Exactly. And your medical background means you can speak to both clinical needs and patient experiences. That combination is powerful and rare." For the first time in their interactions, James's expression softened slightly. "You're fighting an uphill battle within your own company, aren't you?" Elizabeth smiled thinly. "Stephen Blake, our COO, has already threatened my position. Several board members see these initiatives as dangerous precedents. I have political capital to spend after 15 successful years, but it's finite. And if I say no, if I take the program benefits for Sophie but decline the consulting role, then I fight this battle alone," Elizabeth replied simply. "The Compassionate Access Program proceeds regardless. Sophie gets her medication. And I do my best to prevent corporate inertia from swallowing these reforms whole." The cafe had emptied as they talked, the lunch rush giving way to a quiet lull. Outside, dark clouds gathered, promising an afternoon thunderstorm, a fitting backdrop to the weighty decision hanging between them. James finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of careful deliberation. "I'll need specific guarantees, real input, not just a ceremonial role, access to actual pricing data and cost structures, and most importantly, direct involvement in designing the community clinic initiative to ensure it serves genuine needs rather than corporate image." Elizabeth felt a surge of cautious hope. "All reasonable conditions. I'll have legal draw up amended terms reflecting these requirements. One more thing," James added, his expression hardening again. "The first hint that this is just an elaborate PR exercise, the first time I see my input ignored or Sophie's care compromised, I walk away and take the whole story public. My integrity isn't for sale, even at consultant rates. Rather than offense, Elizabeth felt respect deepen for the man across from her. His unwavering principles were precisely why she needed him. I would expect nothing less. They shook hands across the table, the gesture sealing a tentative alliance that would soon reshape both their lives in ways neither could fully anticipate. Over the next 2 weeks, James was gradually introduced to the inner workings of Reynolds Healthcare. The contrast between his daily life at the auto plant and the gleaming corporate headquarters couldn't have been starker. His first official day as a consultant, he arrived directly from his morning shift work clothes exchanged for his one presentable button-down shirt and slacks. The executive assistants eyed him with poorly concealed curiosity as he was escorted to Elizabeth's office on the top floor. The space was immaculate glass walls offering panoramic views of Minneapolis minimalist furniture in tasteful neutrals and a single-frame photograph on an otherwise pristine desk. James recognized it immediately as Elizabeth, with her husband and son, taken perhaps a year before the accident that claimed their lives. "Thank you for coming." Elizabeth gestured toward the conference area of her office, where folders were arranged precisely on the glass table. These contain the current pricing structures for our pediatric respiratory medications, manufacturing costs, and competitor analyses. I thought we should start with the products most directly relevant to Sophie's care. James approached the materials with professional focus, quickly absorbing the complex financial data. His nursing background had included administrative responsibilities, giving him a foundation for understanding healthcare economics. But the scale of Reynolds' operations was initially overwhelming. What immediately became clear, however, was the staggering disconnect between production costs and market prices. This asthma maintenance inhaler costs less than $5 to manufacture, but retails for over $400, he observed, unable to keep incredulity from his voice. Elizabeth nodded, making no attempt to defend the disparity. The standard industry justification is that pricing reflects research and development costs for both successful and failed products. The reality is more complex and less flattering. Over the next 3 hours, Elizabeth provided a candid education in pharmaceutical economics, patent protections, market exclusivity, insurance reimbursement structures, and the elaborate rebate systems that artificially inflated list prices while providing selective discounts to powerful purchasers. James absorbed it all, asking incisive questions that reflected both his medical knowledge and his personal experience navigating the system as Sophie's father. By the session's end, he had filled a legal pad with notes and observations that would form the foundation of his advisory role. "This is deliberately opaque," he concluded, tapping his pen against the pricing documents. "The complexity obscures the fundamental issue. These medications are priced based on maximum extraction value, not reasonable return on investment." "That's precisely the perspective we need on the Patient Advocacy Committee," Elizabeth confirmed. "Now let's discuss the Community Clinic Initiative. I've scheduled meetings with our medical outreach team tomorrow, but I wanted your initial thoughts first." As they delved into the clinic plans, James gradually relaxed his guard, his expertise and passion for patient care emerging fully. Elizabeth watched him sketch a revised patient flow system on the whiteboard, his movements confident and precise as he illustrated how limited resources could be optimally deployed. "Low-income communities don't need fancy facilities," he explained, outlining a streamlined approach. "They need consistent access, extended hours, and care providers who understand their specific challenges. A single nurse practitioner with proper support can manage many conditions that currently send patients to emergency rooms at 10 times the cost." Elizabeth found herself genuinely impressed by his practical insights. James's combination of formal medical training and real-world experience, both military and civilian, gave him a unique perspective on delivering care with limited resources. "These are exactly the insights we need," she acknowledged, making her own notes. "The board wants showcase facilities with expensive equipment that looks good in promotional materials. You're talking about effective care delivery that actually addresses community needs." James capped his marker, turning to face her directly. "Which brings us to the fundamental question, is this initiative about helping communities or helping Reynolds' image? Because those goals will conflict at decision points, and I need to know which takes priority." The challenge hung in the air between them, direct and unavoidable. Elizabeth recognized it as a test not of her sincerity, which he was beginning to accept, but of her resolve when faced with inevitable corporate pressure. 5 years ago, I would have given you a carefully crafted answer about balancing stakeholder interests, she admitted. Today, I'll simply say this: if the clinics don't meaningfully improve healthcare access and outcomes, they're a waste of resources, regardless of PR value. My goal is to ensure they do both. James nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. Then we have a solid starting point. As their initial session concluded, James gathered his notes, preparing to leave for his security job. The physical toll of maintaining both his regular employment and the new consulting role was evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. James, Elizabeth hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. Have you considered reducing your hours at the plant? The consulting compensation should more than offset the loss of income. A flash of stubborn pride crossed his face. I don't leave commitments half-finished. When the current production order is complete in 3 weeks, I'll reevaluate. Until then, I made promises to my team. Elizabeth recognized the futility of arguing and instead nodded her understanding. At least let me arrange for a car service to transport you between appointments. It would be a more efficient use of your limited time. To her surprise, James agreed to this practical compromise, and they parted with a growing sense of mutual respect despite their vastly different worlds. The following day brought James face to face with the broader Reynolds corporate culture as Elizabeth introduced him to the medical outreach team. The conference room buzzed with a mixture of curiosity and veiled skepticism as executives assessed the plain-spoken former nurse, now influencing their CEO. Melissa Winters, the marketing director, was particularly transparent in her disapproval. While Mr. Cooper's frontline experience is certainly valuable, her pause conveyed exactly the opposite sentiment. We should remember that community healthcare initiatives require sophisticated understanding of demographics, insurance frameworks, and regional healthcare policies. James met her condescension with calm confidence. You're absolutely right, Ms. Winters. Fortunately, managing those frameworks was part of my responsibilities as trauma department coordinator at Minneapolis General. I helped implement their community outreach program, serving primarily uninsured patients, which reduced emergency department utilization by 32% while improving chronic disease management outcomes. A subtle shift occurred in the room as the executives reassessed the man before them. Elizabeth suppressed a smile, having anticipated exactly this dynamic. James Cooper might lack corporate polish, but his quiet competence and unassailable expertise would earn respect from all but the most prejudiced observers. By the meeting's end, initial resistance had largely transformed into cautious engagement, with team members actively soliciting James's input on various aspects of the initiative. Elizabeth observed this integration with satisfaction, recognizing that James's influence would extend further if the corporate team came to value his perspective organically rather than simply complying with her directives. As the weeks progressed, James's involvement deepened beyond the initial consulting parameters. Elizabeth increasingly relied on his perspective, not just for the specific initiatives they had discussed, but for broader questions of corporate responsibility and patient impact. Their professional relationship developed a rhythm, Elizabeth providing context on corporate constraints and priorities, James advocating for patient-centered approaches and ethical pricing. The first public announcement of the Compassionate Access Program generated exactly the positive press Elizabeth had promised the board. Healthcare advocates cautiously praised Reynolds' apparent change of direction, while financial analysts noted the potential competitive advantages of improved public perception during a time of increasing scrutiny on pharmaceutical pricing. Stephen Blake, however, remained a persistent obstacle, questioning every decision and challenging the financial justifications for what he called Elizabeth's charity projects. His opposition grew more pronounced as Elizabeth expanded her reform agenda beyond the initially approved programs. You're exceeding the board's authorization, he warned during a particularly tense executive committee meeting. They approved a limited patient assistance program, not this systematic review of our entire pricing structure. Elizabeth maintained her composure despite his obvious attempt to undermine her authority. The board approved our strategic initiative to get ahead of regulatory pressure and improve our public standing. These reviews are consistent with that directive. Stephen's eyes narrowed dangerously. And your new consultant participating in product development meetings, was that part of the approved initiative as well? The question highlighted Stephen's growing awareness of James's expanding influence. What had begun as a defined advisory role on specific projects had evolved into James providing input across multiple departments, his unique perspective valued by an increasing number of Reynolds executives. Mr. Cooper's insights have proven valuable beyond our initial expectations, Elizabeth replied evenly. Several department heads have requested his participation in their processes. I see no reason to restrict productive collaboration. The confrontation ended in stalemate, but Elizabeth recognized the warning signs of organized opposition forming within the company. Stephen wasn't acting alone. He was consolidating support among executives who shared his traditional profit-first philosophy and felt threatened by the changing corporate direction. This corporate tension formed the backdrop for a more personal development in Elizabeth's relationship with James and Sophie. What began as occasional check-ins regarding Sophie's health gradually evolved into more regular interaction as Elizabeth found herself genuinely invested in the child's well-being. One evening after a particularly productive strategy session that had run late, Elizabeth insisted on driving James home rather than calling the car service. "It's on my way," she claimed, though in reality his modest apartment complex was in the opposite direction from her penthouse. Arriving at his building, they found Sophie sitting on the front steps with Mrs. Grayson, the elderly neighbor who watched her after school. The girl's face lit up with recognition when she spotted Elizabeth in the driver's seat. "It's the helping lady," Sophie exclaimed, bouncing to her feet with the exuberance only a 9-year-old could muster after a full day of school. James smiled apologetically as he exited the car. "Sorry I'm late, Soph. We had a long meeting." "Is your friend coming in?" Sophie asked hopefully, peering at Elizabeth through the car window. "I want to show her my angels." Elizabeth had planned to drop James off and continue to her evening appointments, but something in the child's eager expression made her reconsider. "I'd love to see your angels if your dad doesn't mind." The surprise on James's face quickly gave way to a warm smile. "We'd be honored. Right, Sophie?" "Yes." The girl practically vibrated with excitement. "I made special ones this week. Daddy says they're my best yet." And so Elizabeth found herself in James Cooper's small apartment, surrounded by hundreds of hand-drawn angels taped to nearly every available surface. The images ranged from childish scribbles to surprisingly sophisticated renderings, documenting Sophie's artistic development over the past 3 years. "This was the first one," Sophie explained solemnly, pointing to a crude crayon drawing taped beside the refrigerator. "I made it at the hospital when Daddy told me Mommy went to heaven. See, she has red hair like Mommy did." Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest as she examined the simple drawing, a stick figure with uneven wings and a splash of orange crayon for hair. "It's beautiful, Sophie. After that, I kept making them so Mommy would know we were okay." Sophie continued matter-of-factly, leading Elizabeth on a tour of her angelic gallery. "Daddy says Mommy watches over us, so I put angels everywhere so she can see us in every room." The innocent explanation of this elaborate coping mechanism touched something deep within Elizabeth. She glanced at James, who watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and lingering sadness that resonated with her own experience of loss. "This one's new," Sophie announced, presenting a carefully rendered angel with silver hair. "It's you. You helped me breathe when I had my bad attack, so you're a helping angel." Elizabeth accepted the drawing with unexpected emotion, her customary professional detachment crumbling in the face of this child's simple kindness. "Thank you, Sophie. This is the most beautiful gift I've received in a very long time." As James prepared a simple dinner, insisting Elizabeth join them despite her half-hearted protests, she found herself in the unfamiliar territory of genuine connection. Their conversation flowed naturally from Sophie's school activities to James's former nursing career to Elizabeth's early days as a respiratory specialist. "Did you always want to be a doctor?" Sophie asked, twirling spaghetti around her fork with focused concentration. "I did." Elizabeth smiled, remembering a younger version of herself. "From the time I was about your age. My father was ill when I was growing up, and I was always fascinated by the doctors who helped him. Like Daddy helped people before he fixed cars." Sophie nodded sagely. "He saved lots of people. There are pictures at Grandma's house of Daddy in his army clothes with his medical bags." James looked somewhat embarrassed by his daughter's proud declaration. "I was just doing my job, Soph." "The best medic in our unit," Elizabeth quoted from the military commendation she'd uncovered in her research. performed emergency procedures under active fire on multiple occasions, saving 17 lives during his deployment. James's eyebrows rose in surprise. You really did do thorough research. I make it a point to know who I'm working with, Elizabeth replied, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. Sophie looked between them, sensing the subtle shift in atmosphere. Daddy says knowing things about people is good, but knowing their heart is better. The simple wisdom silenced both adults, each recognizing the fundamental truth in the child's observation. They had begun to move beyond professional collaboration toward genuine understanding, yet barriers of caution and past experience remained. As the evening concluded and Elizabeth prepared to leave, Sophie presented her with another drawing, a hasty sketch of three figures, a tall man, a small girl, and a silver-haired woman, all holding hands beneath a sky filled with watching angels. It's us, Sophie explained unnecessarily. You can keep it in your office like the picture of your boy. Elizabeth froze momentarily, startled by the reference to David. James immediately sensed her discomfort. Sophie, honey, that's Ms. Reynolds' private picture. We shouldn't mention it. But Elizabeth had recovered her composure. It's all right, James. Yes. Sophie, that's my son David. He would have liked you very much. He loved to draw too. Sophie nodded with the solemn understanding that sometimes exists between children who have experienced loss. Is he an angel now, like my mom? The direct question might have been painful from anyone else but from Sophie. With her wall of carefully rendered guardian angels, it held no threat, only compassionate curiosity. Yes, Elizabeth answered simply, he is. The moment created a bridge between them that formal meetings and professional collaboration had not a shared understanding of absence of spaces left unfilled by those they had loved and lost. As Elizabeth finally took her leave, the drawing carefully protected in her briefcase, James walked her to her car. Thank you for tonight, he said quietly. Sophie doesn't get many visitors. Having another adult to talk with, especially a woman, means more to her than you might realize. Elizabeth felt an uncharacteristic uncertainty. I enjoyed it more than I expected. She's a remarkable child, James. You've done an extraordinary job raising her on your own. I had no choice but to be strong for her, he replied, looking back toward their apartment window where Sophie waved enthusiastically. After Catherine died, Sophie became my entire world. Everything I do, every sacrifice, every decision, it's all for her future. The simple declaration illuminated the fundamental difference in their perspectives that still separated them despite growing mutual respect. For James, each corporate policy and pricing decision directly impacted real people with names and faces and angels taped to their walls. For Elizabeth and her executive team, those same decisions had long been abstractions, market segments and demographic groups rather than individuals struggling to breathe. What you're doing at Reynolds, James continued, his voice low but intense. Challenging entrenched profit models, advocating for affordable access. It matters beyond corporate image or even regulatory compliance. It matters to families like mine, to children like Sophie. The weight of responsibility in his words settled over Elizabeth like a physical presence. What had begun as a strategic corporate initiative, motivated partly by personal redemption, had evolved into something more profound, a genuine reckoning with the human impact of her company's practices. I'm trying, she admitted with rare vulnerability, but the resistance within the company is growing stronger. Stephen Blake is mobilizing opposition, questioning my judgment, suggesting I've lost objectivity. James considered this with the tactical assessment of someone who had made life or death decisions under fire. Then we need to demonstrate that ethical practices and financial performance aren't mutually exclusive. Principles without results won't survive a corporate boardroom. The insight demonstrated why Elizabeth had been right to bring James into Reynolds' inner circle. He understood both the moral imperatives and the practical realities of corporate governance. More importantly, he recognized that sustainable change required addressing both simultaneously. You're right, she agreed, a new determination settling over her. We need to accelerate the community clinic initiative. If we can demonstrate improved outcomes and positive financial metrics in the pilot location, the board will have concrete evidence supporting our approach. James nodded, the plan already taking shape between them. Oak Ridge would be this perfect test case, high-need limited existing services in proximity to Minneapolis for oversight. Can you prepare a detailed implementation proposal? Something we can present to the board within 2 weeks. I'll have it ready. James confirmed his expression, reflecting the same focused commitment she had seen when he treated Sophie's asthma attack. This could be the turning point not just for Reynolds, but for how pharmaceutical companies approach community responsibility. As Elizabeth finally drove away, she realized their relationship had fundamentally transformed. What had begun as a calculated recruitment of a useful spokesperson had evolved into a genuine partnership based on shared purpose, if not yet complete trust. The silver-haired angel drawing lay carefully protected in her briefcase, a tangible reminder of what was truly at stake in the corporate battles ahead, not market share or quarterly profits, but the well-being of children like Sophie and families like James's across the country. In her penthouse that night, Elizabeth placed Sophie's drawing beside the photograph of David and Michael, creating an unexpected bridge between her past and present. For the first time in 15 years, the path toward redemption seemed not just visible, but achievable, though the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The abandoned warehouse in Oak Ridge had stood empty for nearly a decade, its brick facade weathered by Midwestern seasons, windows boarded against vandals and urban explorers. Elizabeth Reynolds stood in what had once been the main production floor, now hollow and echoing dust motes dancing in the sunlight that streamed through gaps in the roof. The realtor hovered nearby, visibly nervous about having the CEO of Reynolds Healthcare touring such a decrepit property. It's structurally sound, the realtor offered hopefully, despite cosmetic issues. The zoning permits medical use and the location is central to 3 underserved neighborhoods. James walked the perimeter, his experienced eye assessing the space with practical consideration. High ceilings provide good air circulation. Loading docks could be converted to ambulance access. With proper renovation, we could create 12 exam rooms, a treatment center, pharmacy, and community education space. Elizabeth nodded, already envisioning the transformation from abandoned industrial shell to vital community resource. What's the timeline for bringing it up to code for medical use? 4 to 6 months minimum, the realtor estimated, gaining confidence as he sensed their interest. The property owner is eager to sell. They'd consider favorable terms for a community health project. As they concluded the tour, Elizabeth and James stood in the weed-choked parking lot contemplating the dilapidated building that represented both opportunity and challenge. This is perfect, James gestured toward the warehouse. Not because it's an easy project, but because it makes a statement, taking a symbol of economic decline and transforming it into a center for community health. That's the kind of tangible change people can rally behind. Elizabeth pulled up the neighborhood demographics on her tablet, statistics she'd memorized before considering this location. 40% of residents lack adequate healthcare access. Asthma rates 3 times the national average due to industrial exposure. Median income $14,000 below state average. Numbers that translate to real suffering. James added, the passion in his voice unmistakable. Preventable emergencies, chronic conditions left untreated, children missing, school parents missing work, a cycle that keeps families trapped in poverty. Elizabeth made her decision the kind of swift, confident choice that had characterized her rise to corporate leadership. Let's move forward. I want construction crews mobilized within 2 weeks. This will be our proof of concept, the model for future clinics nationwide. James looked momentarily taken aback by the accelerated timeline. The board hasn't even approved the final proposal yet. I'm not waiting for the board, Elizabeth's voice carried the steel that had made her reputation in the industry. This first clinic will be funded through my personal foundation. No corporate red tape, no quarterly reviews, no compromise on essential services. The admission revealed the extent of her commitment beyond corporate strategy, surprising even James, who had begun to understand the depth of her transformation. You've been planning this regardless of Reynolds' involvement. Since the day you walked into that church with my envelope, Elizabeth confirmed. Some things are too important to leave vulnerable to boardroom politics. This revelation shifted something in their relationship. Elizabeth was no longer simply a corporate executive implementing strategic initiatives, but a woman committing personal resources to address systemic failures she had once helped perpetuate. It was the clearest demonstration yet of her sincerity, more convincing than any corporate program or policy reform. Then let's build something extraordinary. James extended his hand, sealing their partnership with renewed purpose. The 8 weeks that followed unfolded with the intensity of a military deployment, James's description that resonated with Elizabeth as they battled timelines, regulations, and entrenched systems. The abandoned warehouse underwent dramatic transformation. Hazardous materials, removed structural elements, reinforced medical-grade infrastructure installed. Elizabeth leveraged her connections to expedite permits and inspections that might otherwise have delayed the project for months. Meanwhile, James developed clinical protocols designed specifically for the community's needs, streamlined intake processes, extended evening and weekend hours to accommodate working families' integrated care teams, where physicians collaborated with nurse practitioners, mental health counselors, and community health workers. Traditional models fail these communities because they are designed for middle-class patients with reliable transportation, predictable work schedules, and health insurance. James explained during a planning session in the half-renovated space construction, noise creating a backdrop of progress. We're building a system that meets people where they are with the resources they actually have. Elizabeth absorbed these insights, her corporate expertise combining with James's frontline experience to create something neither could have achieved alone. Their working relationship deepened into genuine partnership as they navigated challenges together, Elizabeth clearing bureaucratic obstacles while James ensured every decision prioritized patient needs. The clinic project progressed rapidly, but tensions within Reynolds Healthcare escalated in parallel. Stephen Blake had intensified his opposition campaign, scheduling private meetings with board members and key investors to express concerns about Elizabeth's leadership in the company's strategic direction. "He's building a case for your removal," reported Diane Lewis, Elizabeth's longtime executive assistant and one of the few people at Reynolds she genuinely trusted. The quarterly earnings projections give him leverage were showing the first profit dip in 11 quarters. Elizabeth reviewed the financial reports with practiced efficiency, identifying the tactical narrative Stephen was constructing. He's isolating the impact of the Compassionate Access Program without acknowledging the tax benefits or the positive press coverage value. "The board meeting next week will be contentious," Diane warned. "Several members who previously supported your initiatives are wavering." Rather than anxiety, Elizabeth felt a surprising calm. After decades of corporate infighting, these maneuvers were familiar territory. What had changed was her personal investment into the outcome, not for her position or legacy, but for the thousands of patients who would benefit from the reforms she and James had set in motion. "Prepare comprehensive impact reports on all current initiatives," she instructed. "Financial data, press coverage metrics, prescriber feedback, patient testimonials. We need to demonstrate that ethical practices and business success aren't mutually exclusive." The corporate battle lines were clearly drawn when Elizabeth returned to headquarters the following day. Conversations stopped abruptly when she entered rooms and previously supportive executives suddenly became unavailable for meetings. The isolation tactics were textbook corporate politics designed to demonstrate eroding support and psychological pressure. Elizabeth maintained her typical commanding presence, refusing to show any reaction to the orchestrated freeze-out. Decades of experience had taught her that perceived weakness in corporate environments invited predatory behavior. Instead, she focused on preparing for the board showdown, knowing it would determine not just her professional future, but the fate of everything she and James had built. The morning of the crucial board meeting, Elizabeth received an unexpected call from James. "Sophie's in the hospital," his voice tight with controlled fear. "Severe asthma attack during the night. They've admitted her for observation." Elizabeth immediately abandoned her meeting preparations. "Which hospital? I'm on my way." "Minneapolis Children's." "But the board meeting?" "Can wait," Elizabeth cut him off firmly. "Family comes first." The words slipped out naturally, though their implication that she considered James and Sophie family registered only after she'd spoken. More surprising was the realization that it felt true. In the months since their first encounter, the Coopers had become more than a project or professional association. They had become people she genuinely cared about. Minneapolis Children's Hospital operated with the controlled chaos common to pediatric facilities, medical professionals moving with purposeful efficiency amid anxious parents and children in various states of distress. Elizabeth navigated the environment with the dual perspective of former physician and current pharmaceutical executive, noting both clinical operations and the financial barriers embedded in the system. She found James in Sophie's room, his large frame looking incongruously vulnerable in the child-sized visitor chair. Sophie lay connected to monitors and oxygen, her small chest rising and falling with visible effort despite medication and supportive care. Her O2 levels dropped to 83%, James explained without preamble, medical training evident in his precise reporting. The rescue inhaler wasn't sufficient. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was in respiratory distress. Elizabeth approached Sophie's bedside professional assessment, automatically cataloging symptoms and treatment indicators. Has she been using the controller medication consistently? Yes, this attack came out of nowhere. The doctors suspect a new environmental trigger, possibly construction dust, from the apartment renovations next door. The conversation paused as a nurse entered to check Sophie's vitals and adjust her medication. Elizabeth stepped back, allowing the healthcare professional space to work while observing the child's response to treatment. Though still serious, Sophie's condition showed signs of stabilization, improved color, less labored breathing, steadier vital signs. When they were alone again, Elizabeth noticed the strain etched on James's face, not just concern for Sophie, but the cumulative weight of single parenthood, financial pressure, and physical exhaustion. "When did you last eat or sleep?" she asked quietly. James dismissed the question with a slight shake of his head. "I'm fine. They want to keep her for 24 hours observation. I called the plant, and security company took emergency family leave from both. And the clinic project. The contractor has my instructions for today's installations. I can monitor remotely once Sophie's stable." His determination to maintain all responsibilities despite personal crisis struck Elizabeth forcefully. This was the reality for millions of working parents: no safety net, no delegation options, just the relentless pressure to keep everything functioning regardless of circumstances. "James," Elizabeth placed her hand on his shoulder, the gesture unfamiliar but instinctively right. "Let me help, not as CEO or project partner, but as someone who cares about you both." The simple offer breached something in his carefully maintained composure. James closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself to accept support, perhaps for the first time since Catherine's death. "Thank you." Elizabeth arranged for meals to be delivered to the hospital room, then handled urgent clinic matters requiring immediate attention. By afternoon, Sophie had improved enough to be alert and responsive, though still requiring oxygen support. "Ms. Elizabeth," the child's face brightened with recognition despite her weakened state. "Did you come to see my new hospital drawings? The nurse gave me special markers." Elizabeth moved closer, examining the colorful sketches spread across the bed tray. "These are wonderful, Sophie. You've captured the hospital perfectly." "I'm drawing all the helping people," Sophie explained, pointing to figures in various medical uniforms. "This one's for my doctor. This one's for the nice nurse. And I'm making one for you too." The child's generosity in the midst of her own suffering struck Elizabeth powerfully. Despite serious illness, Sophie's instinct was to create gifts for those helping her, a perspective that shamed many adults who received far more privileged care. "I'd be honored," Elizabeth managed past the unexpected tightness in her throat. "Daddy says you have an important meeting today." Sophie continued, selecting colors with careful consideration. "About helping more sick kids like me." Elizabeth glanced at James, who shrugged slightly. "Sophie likes knowing what's happening. I don't believe in shielding her from reality." "It is an important meeting," Elizabeth confirmed, returning her attention to the child. "But being here with you is more important right now." Sophie looked up, her expression suddenly serious beyond her years. "You should go to your meeting. Daddy and I will be okay. You need to help the other kids who don't have good doctors and medicine." The simple wisdom of this child's perspective crystallized everything Elizabeth had been working toward. Sophie understood intuitively what many corporate executives willfully ignored, that beyond profit margins and market share, their decisions directly impacted vulnerable lives. "You're absolutely right, Sophie," Elizabeth smiled gently, "and that's exactly what I intend to do." With renewed clarity and purpose, Elizabeth left the hospital and headed directly to Reynolds' headquarters for the board meeting. The executive floor buzzed with tension as she arrived, conversations halting abruptly at her appearance. Stephen Blake stood surrounded by allies near the boardroom entrance, his confident stance suggesting he believed victory was imminent. Elizabeth approached without hesitation, corporate armor fully in place. "Stephen, I trust you're prepared for a productive discussion today." The barely perceptible falter in his expression revealed surprise at her composed demeanor. He had clearly expected her to arrive defensive and scrambling after the coordinated opposition campaign. Elizabeth, we were beginning to wonder if you'd join us, and missed the opportunity to discuss Reynolds' future unthinkable. She swept past him into the boardroom, greeting board members with practiced cordiality, while her assistant distributed comprehensive briefing packages to each seat. The meeting began with standard formalities before Stephen launched his carefully orchestrated offensive, presenting financial projections that isolated recent profit margin reductions and attributed them directly to Elizabeth's initiatives. The Compassionate Access Program has reduced revenue by 8.4% in affected product categories. He highlighted a graph showing downward trends. Meanwhile, resources diverted to community projects have delayed development of two promising pipeline products, potentially costing us first-to-market advantage. Board members shifted uncomfortably, financial concerns clearly resonating with their fiduciary responsibilities. Stephen continued his methodical presentation, building a case that Elizabeth's recent decisions prioritize personal rehabilitation over shareholder value. While corporate social responsibility has its place, he concluded with calculated reasonableness. We must question whether current leadership is maintaining appropriate balance between ethical considerations and financial obligations. The implied vote of no confidence hung in the air as Stephen yielded the floor. All eyes turned to Elizabeth, expecting a defensive response or emotional appeal. Instead, she remained perfectly composed and allowing a moment of silence to establish her command of the room. Thank you, Stephen, for that perspective. She began with professional courtesy that belied the high-stakes confrontation. Before I address specific points, I'd like to provide context often missing from purely financial analysis. She rose and moved to the head of the table, activating the presentation display with practiced ease. This morning, I came from Minneapolis Children's Hospital, where 9-year-old Sophie Cooper is being treated for a severe asthma attack, her third hospitalization this year. The image on screen showed Sophie's hospital room, the child connected to oxygen and monitoring equipment. Several board members appeared startled by the sudden human element introduced to their financial discussion. Sophie's father works 2 jobs to support them after her mother's death. Until recently, he rationed her medication because Reynolds' pricing put consistent treatment beyond his financial reach, despite health insurance. Sophie represents thousands of similar children whose health outcomes are directly affected by our pricing decisions. Elizabeth advanced to the next slide, shifting from emotional appeal to hard data. The Compassionate Access Program has indeed reduced per-unit revenue by 8% on selected medications. However, unit sales have increased 23% in these categories as previously untreated patients gained access. Net revenue has increased 11.2% when accounting for volume, while manufacturing efficiencies from increased production have improved margins by 3.7%. She methodically countered each of Stephen's points with comprehensive data demonstrating how initiatives he had characterized as charitable diversions were actually generating positive financial returns through increased prescription rates, improved market share, and enhanced prescriber loyalty. Most significantly, Elizabeth highlighted physician survey results. Prescriber trust in Reynolds has increased 27% since program implementation. In an industry where physician preference drives approximately 60% of medication selection, this goodwill translates directly to bottom-line growth across our entire product portfolio. The board's attention had fully shifted, financial concerns giving way to renewed confidence as Elizabeth systematically dismantled the narrative Stephen had constructed. Several members were now openly reviewing her data with expressions of surprised approval. As for community investments, she continued displaying architectural renderings of the Oak Ridge Clinic. These represent strategic market development in underserved communities. Each clinic creates new prescription channels for Reynolds products while addressing healthcare gaps that currently generate significant public and regulatory pressure on our industry. She concluded with forward-looking projections demonstrating how ethical business practices were positioning Reynolds ahead of likely regulatory changes and building sustainable competitive advantages in an increasingly scrutinized industry. The fundamental question before us isn't whether Reynolds can afford to implement these initiatives. Elizabeth addressed the board directly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. It's whether we can afford not to. In a changing healthcare landscape, companies that adapt proactively will thrive. Those that cling to extractive pricing models will face regulatory intervention, public backlash, and ultimately market irrelevance. The boardroom remained silent as her presentation concluded the comprehensive dismantling of Stephen's opposition, leaving little room for his planned follow-up. Before he could regroup, Elizabeth delivered her final strategic move. "There's one additional announcement relevant to today's discussion," she stated calmly. "The Oak Ridge Community Health Center will open next month, fully funded through my personal foundation rather than corporate resources. This facility will serve as our pilot for data collection on community impact prescription patterns and healthcare cost reduction." This revelation changed the entire dynamic of the meeting. By personally funding the pilot facility, Elizabeth had simultaneously demonstrated her commitment beyond corporate strategy while removing the project's financial risk from Reynolds' balance sheet, a move that left Stephen without his primary leverage point. "The board is now faced with a straightforward strategic choice," Elizabeth concluded. "Reynolds can either lead the industry transformation towards sustainable ethical practices, or we can extract maximum short-term profit until regulatory intervention forces change. I believe the former represents both better business judgment and better human values." The subsequent discussion revealed a clear shift in board sentiment. What had begun as a potential vote of no confidence transformed into renewed support for Elizabeth's leadership and strategic direction. Even board members previously aligned with Stephen acknowledged the compelling business case she had presented. As the meeting adjourned, Elizabeth received congratulatory nods from several board members, while Stephen retreated with his diminished faction, their attempt to seize control thoroughly defeated. The corporate battle had been decisively won, but Elizabeth found her thoughts immediately returning to the hospital where James and Sophie waited. She drove directly to Minneapolis Children's, arriving to find Sophie's condition significantly improved. The child sat upright in bed, breathing without supplemental oxygen, focused intently on a drawing, while James reviewed medical charts on a tablet. "Good news," James looked up as Elizabeth entered. "They're releasing her tomorrow morning if her oxygen levels remain stable overnight." "That's wonderful." Elizabeth moved to Sophie's bedside, genuinely relieved. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Much better." Sophie held up her latest artwork, a colorful rendition of three figures standing before a large building. "Look, I drew our special hospital. That's you and Daddy and me in front. All the sick kids and their families are inside getting better." Elizabeth examined the drawing, recognizing the Oak Ridge Clinic rendered with surprising accuracy from the architectural images Sophie had glimpsed. The child had captured not just the physical structure, but the underlying purpose, a place of healing and hope emerging from community need. "It's perfect." Elizabeth smiled, accepting the artwork. "May I keep this? I'd like to have it framed for the clinic entrance." Sophie beamed with pride at having her creation valued so highly. "Yes, then everyone will know it's a place for helping." Later, as Sophie napped under James's watchful eye, Elizabeth shared the board meeting outcome in hushed tones. "So we move forward with full corporate backing." James processed the implications. "What changed their minds?" "Data," Elizabeth replied simply. "Financial projections demonstrating that ethical practices can drive sustainable growth." The board responds to numbers more reliably than moral arguments. James nodded, understanding the corporate reality she navigated. "And Stephen Blake?" "Neutralized for now, though not eliminated as a threat. He'll regroup and try again if given opportunity." They sat in companionable silence, watching Sophie's peaceful sleep, a child blissfully unaware of the corporate battles fought partly in her name. The quiet moment held its own significance, a rare interval of stillness in their otherwise urgent mission to transform healthcare access. "I've been offered the chief medical officer position at Minneapolis General," James said, suddenly breaking the contemplative silence. "They reached out last week. Apparently my work on the clinic project has attracted attention." The news landed unexpectedly, disrupting Elizabeth's sense of their shared path forward. "That's an incredible opportunity. Will you take it?" James looked torn, genuine conflict evident in his expression. "It would mean leaving the clinic project before completion, abandoning what we've built together just as it's becoming reality. But returning to medicine, to your true calling," Elizabeth countered gently, "using your skills directly with patients rather than through administrative channels." "There's more impact potential in what we're doing," James argued, revealing how deeply he had invested in their shared vision. changing systems rather than treating individual patients. Elizabeth recognized his dilemma, the same one she had faced years earlier, when choosing between clinical practice and corporate leadership. Perhaps there's a middle path. The clinic will need a medical director, once operational, someone who understands both clinical excellence and community needs. The possibility created a new perspective, a way to combine direct patient care with systems-level influence. Split responsibility, James considered thoughtfully. Clinical leadership at the center while maintaining advisory capacity with Reynolds on expansion projects. Exactly. The best of both worlds, hands-on care and structural reform. Their collaborative problem-solving demonstrated how completely aligned they had become, instinctively finding solutions that honored both practical realities and shared vision. This synchronicity extended beyond professional matters, creating a personal connection neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as the Oak Ridge Clinic neared completion. Construction crews worked around the clock to meet the accelerated timeline, transforming the abandoned warehouse into a state-of-the-art medical facility designed specifically for community needs. Elizabeth divided her time between corporate responsibilities and clinic development, often working alongside James as they finalized operational details. Their complementary expertise created solutions neither could have developed alone. Elizabeth's business acumen, ensuring financial sustainability, while James's clinical experience guaranteed patient-centered care. The pharmacy needs direct access from the waiting area. James adjusted the floor plan during a late-night planning session. Many patients will come primarily for prescriptions. We should minimize barriers. Elizabeth immediately grasped the practical implication and stocked the formulary with 90-day supply options for stable chronic conditions, reduces transportation barriers for patients with limited mobility or unreliable transportation. Their collaborative rhythm had become so natural that they often completed each other's thoughts, anticipating concerns and generating solutions with remarkable efficiency. This professional partnership had gradually extended into personal territory as Elizabeth became increasingly integrated into James and Sophie's lives. What began as occasional shared meals evolved into regular weekend activities, museum visits, park outings, cooking lessons, where Elizabeth discovered a surprising joy in Sophie's enthusiasm for learning. For a woman whose adult life had been dominated by corporate achievement, these simple domestic pleasures offered unexpected fulfillment. The night before the clinic's official opening, Elizabeth, James, and Sophie walked through the completed facility in private celebration. The transformation was remarkable: sterile medical efficiency softened by thoughtful design elements that created warmth and welcome. Sophie's drawing, professionally framed, hung prominently in the entrance lobby, embodying the center's founding vision. It doesn't seem real. James surveyed the finished space with quiet amazement. 3 months ago, this was an abandoned building. Tomorrow, it starts changing lives. It already has, Elizabeth observed, watching Sophie explore the cheerful pediatric examination rooms with curious delight. Ours included. The comment held deeper significance than either acknowledged directly. Their professional collaboration had evolved into something more personal, a connection based on shared purpose that increasingly resembled family. Neither had put this transformation into explicit words, both protective of the fragile new reality they were creating together. The clinic's grand opening drew unexpected attention, with local media covering the event as a potential model for community healthcare. Elizabeth and James stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Sophie between them holding ceremonial scissors nearly as large as she was. The symbolism wasn't lost on the assembled crowd. Corporate leadership and medical expertise united in community service, with the child representing those who would benefit most. The Cooper Reynolds Community Health Center represents a new approach to healthcare delivery. Elizabeth addressed the gathered community members and press. Not charity or corporate social responsibility, but a sustainable model that recognizes health as both a human right and a community asset. James continued seamlessly, their presentation reflecting their unified vision. Every design element, clinical protocol, and operational process was developed with one question in mind: how do we remove barriers between patients and care? The result is a facility that meets community needs rather than expecting community members to adapt to traditional healthcare models. As the ceremonial ribbon fell and applause erupted, Elizabeth felt an unfamiliar sense of fulfillment entirely distinct from corporate achievement. This wasn't about market share or quarterly earnings, but tangible human impact, creating infrastructure that would improve thousands of lives long after today's ceremony ended. The center immediately proved its value, and as patients began arriving even during opening festivities, many having waited months or years for affordable care. James seamlessly transitioned from ceremony participant to clinical director, greeting patients and guiding the medical team with natural authority. Elizabeth observed with admiration as he moved between administrative and clinical roles, his genuine connection with patients highlighting what healthcare could be when profit wasn't the primary motivation. Late that evening, after the last patient had been seen and the staff had departed, Elizabeth found James in his new office reviewing the day's patient records. Sophie had fallen asleep on the small couch, exhausted from the excitement. 47 patients on opening day. James looked up from his computer, tired but deeply satisfied. 12 children with untreated asthma, 8 undiagnosed diabetics, 23 patients who hadn't seen a doctor in over 5 years due to cost barriers. The statistics represented not just medical conditions, but lives that would now follow different trajectories because of their work together. This is just the beginning. Elizabeth sat across from him, equally exhausted but fulfilled. The data from today alone builds the case for expansion. I've already identified potential locations in 3 additional communities with similar need profiles. James studied her with thoughtful consideration. When we first met, I thought you were just another corporate executive looking for PR opportunities. I never imagined you'd become. He trailed off, the unspoken sentiment hanging between them. Their relationship had evolved beyond professional collaboration into something neither had fully defined. Neither did I, Elizabeth acknowledged quietly. Meeting you and Sophie changed everything. My priorities, my perspective, my understanding of what matters. The moment held potential for deeper personal revelation, but Sophie stirred on the couch, momentarily redirecting their attention. James gently adjusted the blanket covering his daughter, the tender gesture embodying the devoted parenthood that had first impressed Elizabeth months earlier. We should get her home. James spoke softly, reluctant to break the peaceful moment. Tomorrow will be another busy day. Elizabeth nodded, equally reluctant to end the day that represented such meaningful achievement. As they prepared to leave, Sophie awoke just enough to reach for Elizabeth's hand alongside her father's, creating a physical connection that mirrored their increasingly intertwined lives. Outside the transformed building stood, illuminated against the night sky, Cooper Reynolds Community Health Center, displayed prominently above the entrance. The hyphenated name represented more than just professional collaboration. It symbolized 2 lives that had unexpectedly converged around shared purpose and growing affection. Would you like to join us for breakfast tomorrow? James asked as they reached their cars, the invitation carrying subtle significance beyond the simple meal. Sophie wants to make her special pancakes to celebrate the successful opening. Elizabeth found herself accepting without hesitation the prospect of domestic morning routine with James and Sophie more appealing than any executive privilege or luxury experience. I'd love that. As they parted ways for the evening, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple envelope, dropped in a diner, a test that she had intended as manipulation, but had ultimately transformed her own life more profoundly than James's. What began as corporate strategy had evolved into personal redemption and unexpected connection. The following morning found Elizabeth at James's apartment, helping Sophie prepare her special pancakes, while James finished a conference call with the clinic's medical staff. The domestic scene would have been unimaginable to anyone who knew Elizabeth only as Reynolds Healthcare's formidable CEO, the corporate executive in an apron flower dusting her hands as she guided Sophie's enthusiastic but imprecise measuring techniques. Daddy says you're going to help build more special hospitals, Sophie commented as she carefully added chocolate chips to the batter in the rough shape of a heart. So all the kids can breathe good like me. Elizabeth smiled at the child's simple summary of their complex healthcare initiative. That's right. Your dad and I want to make sure every child has doctors and medicine when they need it. Sophie considered this with serious concentration while stirring the batter. Will you have to go away to build the other hospitals, or will you stay with us? The innocent question cut to the heart of what remained unspoken between Elizabeth and James, the personal relationship developing alongside their professional partnership. Before Elizabeth could formulate an appropriate response, James entered the kitchen, having completed his call. "The first day metrics are remarkable," he announced, seemingly unaware of the meaningful conversation he had interrupted. "Patient satisfaction scores at 96%, average wait time under 15 minutes. We're already booked solid for the next 3 weeks." Elizabeth welcomed the shift to professional matters, though Sophie's question lingered in her mind. "That validates our operational model. If we can maintain those metrics with increasing patient volume, we'll have compelling evidence for expansion." Their conversation flowed naturally between clinic operations and domestic matters as they enjoyed Sophie's heart-shaped pancakes together. This easy integration of professional and personal domains had become characteristic of their relationship, a shared life organized around common purpose, rather than arbitrary distinctions between work and home. After breakfast, they drove together to the clinic, where patients already waited outside despite the early hour. James immediately shifted into his clinical director role, while Elizabeth conducted a follow-up interview with a healthcare policy journal that had covered the opening. "The traditional model separates healthcare delivery from medication access," she explained to the journalist. "Patients receive treatment plans they cannot implement due to cost barriers. The Cooper-Reynolds approach integrates affordable medication access directly into the treatment protocol, ensuring prescriptions become reality rather than financial burden." As the journalist departed, Elizabeth noticed Stephen Blake's luxury SUV pulling into the parking lot, an unexpected and concerning development. Her corporate rival had maintained strategic distance since his boardroom defeat, rebuilding his position rather than engaging in open confrontation. Stephen entered the clinic with calculated casualness, observing the bustling operation with clinical detachment. "Impressive transformation," he commented as Elizabeth approached. "From warehouse to healthcare in record time. The board is quite pleased with the media coverage." Elizabeth maintained professional composure despite her suspicion. "What brings you here, Stephen? This is outside your operational oversight." "Professional curiosity." He smiled without warmth. "And perhaps personal concern. Your involvement here has become quite intensive. Some board members wonder if Reynolds is receiving appropriate executive attention with your focus so clearly directed elsewhere." The implied threat was characteristic of Stephen's approach, using Elizabeth's personal investment in the clinic as leverage against her corporate position. Before the events of recent months, such a maneuver might have succeeded in forcing her to choose between professional advancement and personal commitment. "The board has comprehensive metrics on both corporate performance and clinic impact," Elizabeth responded coolly. "Reynolds' market position has strengthened since implementation of our community initiatives, with stock price up 8% and prescriber preference metrics showing significant improvement. My focus seems to be generating positive results on all fronts." Stephen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "For now, but sustainability requires consistency. This project clearly means more to you than typical corporate initiatives. One might even say it's become personal." Before Elizabeth could respond, Sophie came running from the pediatric area where she had been helping organize the children's book, stopping short when she noticed the unfamiliar man speaking with Elizabeth. "Ms. Elizabeth, Daddy says to tell you Mrs. Garcia is here with all 6 of her grandbabies for their checkups. He says it's just like we planned in our special notebook." The child's innocent interruption highlighted exactly what Stephen had been implying: Elizabeth's personal connection to James and Sophie, extending far beyond professional collaboration. Stephen observed the interaction with calculated assessment, clearly filing away this confirmation of his suspicions. "Well, well," his voice carried false warmth. "You must be Sophie. I've heard so much about you." Sophie regarded him with the straightforward appraisal unique to children, clearly sensing the underlying tension despite the pleasant words. "Are you a doctor too?" "No," Stephen chuckled without humor. "I work with Reynolds at the big company." "Do you help sick kids get better too?" Sophie persisted, applying her simple metric for evaluating adults. The question momentarily disrupted Stephen's composed facade. "I ensure the company operates efficiently." Sophie processed this vague explanation with visible skepticism before turning back to Elizabeth. Daddy needs you for the grandmother with lots of babies. He says it's important. Thank you, Sophie. Elizabeth placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. Please tell your father I'll be right there. As Sophie departed, Elizabeth faced Stephen, directly abandoning pretense of casual professional exchange. Make your point clearly, Stephen. What exactly are you implying about my relationship with the clinic directors? Stephen's expression shifted to calculated concern. Only that personal entanglements can cloud business judgment. The board values your leadership, Elizabeth, but they expect clear separation between corporate strategy and personal attachment. The threat was unmistakable. Stephen was positioning Elizabeth's relationship with James and Sophie as a potential conflict of interest ammunition for his next attempt to challenge her leadership. My judgment has never been clearer, Elizabeth replied with quiet intensity. Perhaps because I now see the human impact of our corporate decisions, rather than viewing them as abstract financial calculations. The board has endorsed this perspective with their continued support. Stephen stepped closer, lowering his voice. Boards can be fickle, especially when presented with evidence of compromised objectivity. Your family activities with the clinic director and his daughter create concerning optics, at minimum potential conflicts of interest at worst. Elizabeth felt cold anger rising at the implied threat to her relationship with James and Sophie. For decades, she had navigated corporate politics with strategic calculation, always maintaining professional distance. Now faced with an attack that targeted not just her leadership, but her personal life, she found herself responding from a place of authentic conviction rather than tactical positioning. Let me be perfectly clear. Her voice remained measured, but carried unmistakable warning. My personal relationships are not corporate property or boardroom leverage. My leadership of Reynolds Healthcare stands on measurable results and strategic vision, both of which remain exceptional by every objective metric. Stephen seemed momentarily taken aback by her direct confrontation, having expected the cautious corporate maneuvering that had characterized their previous encounters. Furthermore, Elizabeth continued, any attempt to weaponize my personal life against my professional position will be recognized for exactly what it is, a desperate tactical move from someone who failed to win on strategic merits. Choose your next steps carefully, Stephen. With that clear boundary established, Elizabeth turned and walked away, leaving Stephen standing alone in the clinic lobby. The encounter had crystallized something important. Her relationship with James and Sophie had become central to her life, not a vulnerability to be protected, but a priority to be defended. She found James in the pediatric examination area, efficiently managing the complex logistics of examining multiple children from a single family while maintaining both medical thoroughness and human connection. His easy rapport with the grandmother and genuine interest in each child's development reflected the medical professional he had always been beneath the factory worker exterior Elizabeth had first encountered. Watching him work, Elizabeth felt absolute certainty about the path they had forged together, both the professional partnership that had created this transformative clinic and the personal relationship still evolving between them. Whatever challenges Stephen or others might create, the foundation they had built would withstand corporate politics and personal doubts alike. As the day progressed, Elizabeth made a decision that had been forming gradually over recent months. The clinic's success and James's natural leadership as medical director had proven the model viable. Her corporate position had secured the resources and influence needed to launch the initiative. Now, with the concept validated and expansion plans developing, perhaps it was time to consider a different role, one that aligned more closely with her renewed sense of purpose. That evening, after the clinic closed, Elizabeth joined James and Sophie for dinner at their apartment, a routine that had become increasingly frequent. As Sophie busied herself organizing her colored pencils for an evening drawing session, Elizabeth shared her encounter with Stephen and the thoughts it had triggered. He'll use our relationship against me in the boardroom, she explained, describing Stephen's thinly veiled threat. Not because it actually compromises my leadership, but because it gives him leverage with more traditional board members. James considered this with characteristic thoughtfulness. Does that concern you? Our relationship becoming corporate ammunition? The question contained layers of meaning beyond the immediate corporate politics acknowledgement that their connection had evolved beyond professional collaboration into something neither had fully defined, but both clearly valued. What concerns me, Elizabeth replied with careful honesty, is that I've spent 15 years prioritizing corporate achievement above all else. Meeting you and Sophie has reminded me what actually matters, the impact we have on others, the connections we form, the lives we touch directly, rather than through corporate initiatives. This admission represented significant vulnerability from a woman whose professional success had been built partly on maintaining careful control of emotions and relationships. James recognized the importance of what she was sharing. "Are you considering leaving Reynolds?" he asked perceptively. Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I've accomplished what I returned to do, redirected corporate focus toward patient access, established the Compassionate Access Program, launched the Clinic Initiative. Perhaps it's time for new leadership to carry these programs forward while I focus on clinic expansion through my foundation." The possibility created a moment of shared vision. Elizabeth freed from corporate constraints to work directly with communities, while James provided medical leadership, their complementary strengths creating healthcare access where traditional systems had failed. "We make a good team," James observed quietly, the statement encompassing both their professional partnership and the deeper personal connection neither had yet fully articulated. "We do," Elizabeth agreed, allowing herself to acknowledge what had been developing between them, "in ways I never anticipated when I dropped that envelope in the diner." Sophie returned with her drawing materials, settling between them at the kitchen table. "I'm making a special picture of our family for the new hospital," she announced, selecting colors with careful consideration. "With all the angels watching us help people." The child's simple declaration of what they had become, a family united by shared purpose and growing affection, created a moment of profound clarity for both adults. What had begun as corporate strategy and integrity testing had transformed into something neither could have anticipated, but both now recognized as precious. As Sophie worked on her drawing, James and Elizabeth exchanged a look of quiet understanding. The path forward would hold challenges: corporate opposition, logistical complexities of clinic expansion, the delicate integration of their personal and professional lives. But the foundation they had built together provided something essential for navigating these challenges: shared purpose reinforced by genuine connection. Outside the apartment window, dusk settled over Oak Ridge, the transformed clinic visible in the distance, lights still illuminating the Cooper Reynolds sign that represented their unexpected journey from adversaries to partners to family. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and new opportunities to extend their model of care to communities beyond. But for tonight, in this moment of quiet domesticity, the future seemed not just possible but bright with promise.